You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
How many discounts does USAA Auto Insurance offer? Too many to say here. Multi-vehicle discount, safe driver discount, new vehicle discount, storage discount, legacy.
How many discounts will you stack up? Visit USAA.com/auto discounts. Restrictions apply.
Hilton brings you new ways to stay. With experiences that let you capture the glory days. Introducing the Graduate Hotels. Each inspired by local college towns, these stays are always original and never boring. Get in touch with traditions all across the country and enjoy a stay that's a class above the rest. Book at Graduate Hotels with Hilton Honors Points at Hilton.com. It's a win-win. Hilton, for the stay.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 215, The Battle Before Britain, Part 7, Attrition over France. This week, a big thank you goes out to Jihu, George, and Comrade Red for supporting the podcast by becoming members. Members get access to ad-free versions of all of the podcast episodes, plus special member-only episodes released roughly once a month. Head over to historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members to find out more. While organizing the podcast episodes for both the Fall of France and Battle of Britain episode series, there was a major problem. Really, the stories end up intertwining near the end of May 1940, due to the defeats that both nations had suffered at the front. I made the decision to focus on events in France during the Fall of France series, and I don't necessarily regret that, but it is important to remember that during the events of late May to early June 1940, even as thoughts were beginning to turn to British plans in a post-France world, fighting in France was continuing. The balancing act between preparing for the defense of the home islands and meeting their obligations to their continental allies would occupy no small amount of meetings, discussions, and memorandums in London during this time. Due to the mobility of their resources, the Royal Air Force was at the center of these discussions. Unlike ground forces, if a decision was made to send aircraft either over France or to base them in France, that order could be executed in only a matter of hours. This created the scenario where help could quickly be sent to the continent, but it also meant that the losses might be suffered by the Royal Air Force over France, and those losses could balloon rapidly unless someone had an eye for the future. Unfortunately for the troops in France, several people in Britain did have their eyes on the future, including Air Chief Marshal Dowding, who would be the leading voice for a policy of force conservation. His arguments and their success would have an important impact on limiting the commitments of British pilots and aircraft to the defense of France, even as the calls from the French government became ever more urgent that more assistance was needed. Most of the arguments that Dowding would present would be based around pre-war planning. And before the war, the goal had been for Fighter Command to increase its size to 57 squadrons, a number that was felt to provide sufficient fighters to both defend the home islands while also providing aircraft for a planned British expeditionary force. However, when the war started, there were only 32 squadrons available, and only 21 of them were equipped with Hurricanes and Spitfires, which meant that it was only 21 squadrons that could really have a hope of matching up against German fighters. This number did increase during the phony war period, and by May 1940 the number would be up to 47, but that's still 10 short of expectations. At that point, the number of effective aircraft began to drop due to the fighting in France, while at the same time more squadrons would be sent to the continent in the early days of the German offensive. And even those squadrons that were never permanently based in France might still fly over France to fight, with a common practice being for fighter squadrons based on air bases in England to fly over to France for sorties during the day. For example, 32 Squadron, which was based out of Biggin Hill near London, was an example of a squadron that routinely participated in these activities. For example, on May 17th, the squadron would start the day at Biggin Hill, then they would fly to Manston on the far eastern end of Kent before flying to France at Abbeville. Once in France, they refueled and began a patrol around Lille before flying back to Abbeville. Then they would do another patrol before finally flying back to Biggin Hill in the evening. This was one way to increase RAF fighter presence in France without committing squadrons completely, as these over-the-channel missions could be increased or decreased on a daily basis if desired to control the risk to fighter command over France. But it was also really exhausting. One of the men who would fly those missions on May 17th that I just mentioned was Pete Brothers, and he would describe the tempo of operations during this time like this. Quote, "We'd go over at first light, refuel, operate in France, come back in the dark to Biggin Hill, get a meal, fall into bed, and be woken up almost instantly because there wasn't much darkness and we were off again. Dawn was beginning. There was just about enough daylight to see around." While there were benefits to this mission structure, it still put British fighters at risk over France, and Air Chief Marshal Dowding, the head of Fighter Command, almost immediately began to raise concerns about the current wastage being experienced by the RAF over France. In Dowding's view, and it was a view widely shared, Fighter Command had been created to, and expanded for, the purpose of providing air defense over Britain. Each fighter that was sent to France and lost was one that could not participate in its primary mission. And he was not exactly quiet about these views, discussing them at multiple war cabinet and other leadership meetings as he advocated for not sending more aircraft to France. While Dowding's sort of viewpoint was quite narrow, he had a job as head of Fighter Command and he was protecting it, Churchill and the other British leaders had to weigh several different viewpoints, because while Dowding was advocating for keeping fighters in Britain, the leaders of the BEF, for example, in France, and the French government were constantly asking for more. These calls only grew louder and more urgent in the days after the invasion as the situation at the front deteriorated rapidly and Allied aircraft losses began to mount. Shortly after the retreats began from the German attacks, discussions of invasion actually started in the British War Cabinet, which gave Dowding way more ammunition to use in his arguments. May 15th would be an important day for this conversation when it was decided by the War Cabinet to send an additional 4 fighter squadrons to France, with 2 more to possibly follow. Dowding was quite displeased at this development and would write a letter to the Cabinet on May 16th, stating, quote, "I believe that, if an adequate fighter force is kept in this country, if the fleet remains in being, and if home forces are suitably organized to resist invasion, we should be able to carry on the war single-handed for some time. But if the home defense force is drained away in desperate attempts to remedy the situation in France, defeat in France would involve the final, complete, and irredeemable defeat of this country." End quote. It's interesting to see the threat of invasion already playing a major role in arguments at this stage of the battle. This is, again, mid-May, a week after the German invasion had started. Dowding's viewpoint would eventually sort of win the argument, because as discussed in the episodes on the invasion of France, over the course of the last 2 weeks of May and then into early June, the answers to many French pleas for more aircraft would begin to be rejected by the British leaders. It was not that they wanted France to lose, but simply they did not believe that a larger commitment and ever greater losses would save France. More commitments of valuable fighters would simply mean falling into a sunk cost fallacy. In total, the RAF would lose over 900 aircraft during the fighting over the continent during the period of fighting in France, and they would also suffer over 1,500 casualties and airmen during that time, many of which were valuable pre-war trained aircrew that could not be easily replaced. The only good news was that the fighter production had continued to increase over the months, but it seemed to never be enough to keep up with attrition while also continuing to expand the number of fighter squadrons available.
Out here, there's no one way of doing things. No unwritten rules, and no shortage of adventure. Because out here, the only requirement is having fun. Bank of America invites kids 6 to 18 to golf with us. For a limited time, sign them up for a free 1-year membership, giving them access to discounted tee times at thousands of courses. Learn more at bankofamerica.com/golf with us. What would you like the power to do? Bank of America. Restrictions apply. See BofA.com/golf with us for complete details. Copyright 2025 Bank of America Corporation.
Are you still quoting 30-year-old movies? Have you said cool beans in the past 90 days? Do you think Discover isn't widely accepted? If this sounds like you, you're stuck in the past. Discover is accepted at 99% of places that take credit cards nationwide. And every time you make a purchase with your card, you automatically earn cash back. Welcome to the now. It pays to Discover. Learn more at discover.com/credit card, based on the February 2024 Nielsen report.
With all the worry in London about the attrition experienced by the RAF, another major factor in the fighting in the months ahead would also be the losses experienced by the Luftwaffe during that same period. It can be easy to view the Luftwaffe during this period of the war as some kind of impervious, unstoppable steamroller as the Wehrmacht rolled over country after country, but the actual details were quite different. The Luftwaffe was far from broken by the end of the fighting in France, but they were certainly less capable at the end of the campaign than they had been at the beginning. Each of the campaigns that the Luftwaffe participated in at the start of the war cost them aircraft, either destroyed or damaged, both in the air and on the ground. During operations in Poland, 285 aircraft had been destroyed, 279 had been damaged, which combined was about 1/5 of the total Luftwaffe aircraft involved in the campaign. And some of those losses had nothing to do with the enemy. Two important causes of attrition were always accidental damage, which were often in the form of fires on the ground, or accidents that would happen during flight. Flying close air support sorties over German ground troops was also an area where high rates of attrition were often experienced. Now, attrition had always been expected with these type of operations, but even against the heavily under-equipped Polish troops, the loss rates had been much higher than expected. Then, during the Norwegian campaign, another 260 aircraft had been lost. Numbers would be built back up before the fighting in France started, but doing so required most of the output of the German aircraft industry at this time, with little ability to continue to expand the Luftwaffe's size and capabilities. During this period before the invasion of France, the Luftwaffe was also at a disadvantage due to the type of operations that it planned to participate in the future, including the invasion of England. These operations would not just require fighters and bombers, but a whole host of supporting aircraft types would be required. This spread German production capacity over many different types of aircraft, at a time when their enemies, like the British, were beginning to focus very clearly on frontline fighter numbers. As always, there was also the problem of the availability of materials for aircraft production, which had been problematic before the war, but had only gotten worse after the opening campaigns. The Luftwaffe was not the only service that was trying to make up for attrition of earlier campaigns in the run-up to the fighting in France, and the steel that was available to German manufacturers would become even more scarce during this time. All of this would then get worse due to losses experienced in France, which would only be even higher than what they'd suffered earlier in the war. The result of these competing demands was a production rate that fell far short of making good losses at the front. One of the ways that this would be compensated for was by pushing a greater percentage of the available aircraft into frontline service. This had the effect of hollowing out the Luftwaffe even before the Battle of Britain, as the number of reserve aircraft and spare parts dwindled in an attempt to keep their frontline squadrons as full as possible. Another effect of this change was that the serviceability rates began to fall, as aircraft were kept at the front longer and experienced the inevitable damage and breakdowns from heavy use. All of these problems also impacted not just fighters and bombers, but also all different types of supporting aircraft, like the Ju-52, which was the Luftwaffe's most numerous transport aircraft, and one that would be used to transport airborne troops for any airborne operations. During their operations over the Netherlands and Belgium, the Ju-52s had suffered heavy attrition, and there had been just 24 new Ju-52s produced in May 1940. This meant that even if the Germans wanted to drop airborne troops over Britain, a lack of transport aircraft would make it difficult to stage the operation. Some of these production issues would be solved in the months and years that followed sort of the summer of 1940, but particularly during the first half of that year, there was a real hesitancy to fully commit the German economy to wartime production. This would have involved a heavy curtailment of civilian production and a drop in the German standard of living for at least the near future, a sacrifice that Hitler in particular was not ready to make. This resulted in a situation where the Luftwaffe, in the run-up to its greatest sort of challenge up to this point in the war, the Battle of Britain, would actually not be as strong as it had been at the start of the invasion of France. All of these concerns and discussions about German production were mirrored by what was happening in London, where the topic of production numbers and efficiency were a major topic of conversation. During 1939, the Germans had outproduced the British in the air, but it was far closer than it had been the year before. 1939 was also the last year until 1944 that the Germans produced more aircraft than the British. One of the men credited with this turnaround was Lord Beaverbrook, who was appointed the Minister for Aircraft Production in May 1940. Beaverbrook was the owner of the newspaper publisher that produced the Daily Express, a conservative newspaper that caused him to be quite close to the conservative politicians before the war, the same politicians that were now in power. He would be brought in to increase British aircraft production in any way possible. But as with most such positions, while Beaverbrook did play his role as minister, and he did it quite well, and while he did oversee a massive increase in overall production, most of the decisions that made this increase possible were made months and years before he became minister. Of course, the people who had made those decisions were not at the head of one of the largest newspapers in the world, and were not nearly as good at self-promotion as Beaverbrook. And then they were not in the right place at the right time to take advantage of the decisions that they'd made. But Beaverbrook would also still make important decisions and contributions. And this was because, as is so often the case, once the problem of aircraft production began to be solved and then accelerated, another problem was found. Who was going to fly these aircraft? Pilot numbers became the new bottleneck for the RAF during the summer of 1940, particularly before the heavy fighting of July through October. During the height of the Battle of Britain, there would be a high rate of attrition among aircraft, but a far less rate of attrition among pilots. But before those actions, as they were attempting to build up the number of available fighter squadrons, finding enough pilots to fly them was a real problem. This was one of the reasons that the foreign-born pilots that were covered a few episodes ago were so important. They filled British aircraft, which not only did not have experienced British pilots, but often did not have any pilots at all. Efforts were also made to ensure that anyone in the RAF that had flying experience was not being wasted, or supposedly wasted on administrative duties. Churchill was of the belief that there were many men in the RAF that could fly, but were instead assigned to other, less critical duties. In August, while the fighting was raging, he would say, quote, "The tendency of every station commander is naturally to keep as much in his hands as possible. The admirals do the same. Even when you have had a thorough search, if you look around a few weeks later, you will see more fat has been gathered." End quote. Now, Churchill would not say that until August, but I'm sure the same feelings were held even before the battles of the late summer. In these efforts to increase the size of their fighting force, the British also had the very clear advantage that they knew where their priorities lay, not just in the RAF, but also in armament production as a whole. There were many different areas of the military that required resources. The Royal Navy needed more convoy escorts and every other type of ship. The British Army was trying to find a way to rebuild itself after losing so much equipment during the evacuations from France, where the units involved had lost most of their equipment larger than a machine gun. But above all of these problems were the needs of the RAF, which would always be the first group to be called upon to fight against a German invasion attempt. This focus on aircraft production and the very hard work involved by everybody involved in aircraft production, from Beaverbrook at the top all the way down to the factory workers, the total number of fighters that the British had available to them were not as different from what was available to the Luftwaffe as the total number of aircraft in both air forces might make it seem. In total, the British fighters would be outnumbered over 4-1 in the early stages of the fighting. But that's not really a useful number because most of the German aircraft that are included in that number are bombers. Instead, the British fighters were only outnumbered less than 2-1 in fighters, and only around 1.5-1 in single-engine fighters, which would prove to be the most effective. And those numbers would actually get better for the British over time, after a few very challenging weeks at the start of the battle. The Battle of Numbers would be so critical for the Germans and the British during the summer and autumn of 1940. But something that's always important to remember is that while we have exact numbers for everything today, down to exactly how many fighters were available to each side on a specific day, they didn't really have a good understanding of how many aircraft the other side had available at any given moment. There were estimates, loss estimates, production estimates, and neither of them were necessarily correct at any given time. This means that they were making decisions that were often based on faulty intelligence or a misunderstanding of what the enemy had available on any given day. This is important to remember as we move into episodes about the planning for Operation Sea Lion that the Germans would begin in July 1940. Discussions about that will begin in episode 217 after we take a slight detour next week to talk about Operation Catapult, in which the British, who were allies with the French, would attack the French Navy for reasons we'll get into next episode.